Rabbi, tell everyone to stay home.
Yes, everybody should stay home. Definitely. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Glad that we're all healthy here. And
So far.
yeah, so far, stay home. Wear a mask, stay, and distancing is really important too. More important maybe than a mask.
Yeah.
So we are going to begin. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to do the blessing for studying Torah. And let me move it over here. Okay.
Do you want us to mute ourselves?
Oh, yes, that would be a good idea. Thank you.
Sorry.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. So I'm going to switch over to our Torah portion that we're studying. So last time we looked at the beginning of ha'azinu, which means listen, have ear, or however the older version of that is. And so unfortunately, we're in this section now where God is threatening to really punish people for not following the mitzvot, which is kind of sad. Can everybody see this okay? I squished it up because I wanted to get rid of all the ads on the sides. So, all right, would somebody like to read?
I can read, Rabbi.
Okay, Jane, go ahead.
So we're going to start on 36 then?
Yes.
Okay. The Lord will vindicate his people and relent concerning his servants. When he sees their strength is gone and no one is left, slave or free, he will say, now where are their gods, the rock they took refuge in, the gods who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up to help you. Let them give you shelter.
I mean, that's pretty nasty, right? Like everybody's
and he does the same thing. Doesn't he take sacrifices?
Yeah, good
Doesn't
point.
he
Good
take
point.
wine offerings?
Good point. Yes. Because in fact, one of the first sacrifices is Noah, right?
Yeah.
Sacrifices, and it's pleasing to God, the odor and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And or at least God likes the smell. God doesn't necessarily eat this stuff, but God likes the smell of the sacrifices. But it's basically like, I'm going to really knock you down and no one's going to be there to help you. Certainly not those little gods that you've been worshiping. It's not a very lovely image. Okay.
Should I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay. See now that I myself am he. There's no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. I lift my hand to heaven and solemnly swear, as surely as I live forever, when I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand grasps it in judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, while my sword delivers flesh.
Devours.
Oh, devours flesh.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. The blood of the slain and the captives, the heads of the enemy leaders. Rejoice, your nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will take vengeance on his enemies and make atonement for his land and people.
Lovely way to end the poem, right?
Right. Moses came with Joshua, son of Nun, and spoke all the words of this song in the hearing of the people. When Moses finished reciting all these words to all Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words I have solemnly declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey carefully all the words of this law. They are not just idle words for you, they are your life. By them, you will live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. Should I go on?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. On that same day, the Lord told Moses, go up into the Abarim range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, and view Canaan, the land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So let's come back together for a bit. What do you think about the ending of this particular Torah portion?
It's a continuing punishing God to
Yes.
the very end.
You know, he says, go up on the mountain and you'll die there. It's like, I think
Not only go up in the mountain and you'll die there, what else does God say to Moses?
he says everybody has, you know, that they did not fulfill their responsibilities to God.
Okay, we're gonna get back to that in a moment. But
Is
what's
that
going
gonna
on?
be- Oh,
Felice?
sorry, Rabbi, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, what is going on when he goes up on the mountain? What is he supposed to do up there?
He gets to see the land.
He gets to, I mean, is that like the most torturous thing ever? Like, he's not allowed to go into the land, but God's going to let him go to the top of the mountain and look at it,
And
but not be allowed to go in. It's like holding, you know, a delicious dessert in front of you and saying, look how good this is. And you're not going to get one bite, except it's much worse than that, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that seems really cruel to me. I don't know. Maybe you guys don't think it's cruel.
remember a few years ago, there were those children whose parents, there was a whole bunch of them and they starved them and would put food out. They could see it, but you remember that?
No, I don't.
Oh, yeah, the people out in the desert.
God.
Yeah, they kind of did awful things.
Well, this seems quite cruel to me. You know, it's bad enough you're not allowed to go in. You spent 40 years dealing with these complaining people, and now you're not going in. But now you get to take a peek at it. Okay, so that's one thing.
But
And
wouldn't the
yeah.
rabbis say, wouldn't the rabbis say that this is the last thing that Moses sees? He sees this land. He sees the culmination of 40 years in the desert. So do the rabbis condemn God? Or
No,
I didn't think
No.
so.
of course not. Well, okay, so what is it? What is the reason that Moses is not allowed to enter the land?
Because he struck the rock,
Okay, so
so water.
right. So God had said, you know, okay, we have to go back a little bit. When they're in the desert and they're thirsty, the first time God says to Moses, hit the rock and you'll get water. And apparently there are rocks in the desert that have a layer of something. And if you break it open, there's some kind of water in there. But of course, it wasn't enough to give all the 600,000 Israelites and their wives and children water, but it's based on something real, apparently. Okay, so the first time God says, hit the rock and give them the water. The second time, God says, speak to the rock. And Moses not only hits it once, but twice. So that's one problem. There's some other problems with that whole scene too. Do anybody remember?
What about the 10 Commandments he came down?
What about the 10 Commandments? Yeah, I'm sorry, Susie.
Didn't the first time he got the 10 Commandments?
Oh, he broke them. Good
Broke
point. Good point. Yeah. So Moses has a little bit of a temper problem. The first time we meet him, he kills somebody, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And he breaks the
Mhm.
commandments, which actually the rabbis think is a good thing, because what he's doing is they're worshiping the golden calf.
Mhm.
And here he's got the 10 Commandments, which is basically their promise that they will not worship idols. So he breaks it so that they're not responsible for that particular covenant, so he redoes it. So in other words, they're not guilty of breaking the commandments because the commandments don't exist yet. So that's how the rabbis understand that. But about hitting the rock, what else happens in that scene? Anybody remember? Because it's not just about hitting the rock, and we're not even sure if it is hitting the rock or it's all of his temper outbursts or maybe something else. What does he say to the people when he hits the rock? Okay, so God says,
Something about like you rebels or something.
yes. So first of all, Moses says, "You rebels, shall we get water for you?" So, not only is Moses going to hit the rock, but he's like so fed up with these people. And that's not really a good sign for a leader about to enter a new land, right? So that's a problem. And then Moses says, "Shall we get you this water?" In other words, hey, guess what? It's not you, it's God. So you're not giving credit to God. So there are all these things sort of tangled up in this one scene. And the idea that God says here, you broke faith with me. It's not entirely clear. Is it because you said we're going to get water instead of God? Is it because you hit the rock instead of speaking to it? Does that mean you didn't have, faith that speaking was going to be enough? It's a little bit muddled. And the commentators really struggle with this because after all, doesn't he deserve to go into the land with the people?
Mhm.
So, they think, well, maybe it's because of his temper and his anger issues,
He's only human.
He's only human. Exactly. He can't be perfect. Actually, you know what? These aren't the last words. It seems like they are, but actually one more, sign of life will be coming in the next Torah portion. Yes, Jason.
So I don't know. Sometimes I take a contrarian view of things. So I'm wondering, why doesn't Moses at that point just defy God and try to go into the land? I mean, what's he got to lose at this point? He's already been told, if you climb that mountain, you're going to die. You're not going to get what you want. So if you want to talk about faith, I think he shows that he restored his faith because he listens and he follows what God asks of him to the end, even when it's not what he wants and when it's not in his interest. So I almost would say you could argue he grew to the point, where he did have comfort in knowing that following God's word was the right thing to do. Because I mean, as people, we would surely be tempted to say, why should I follow that path that you've just told me? It doesn't lead me anywhere I want to go. But
So
yet he doesn't.
Jason, don't you think he's seen enough people struck down by God that if he did that, if he took one step across the Jordan River, that this wouldn't be this flash of lightning and that would just blow him up?
Well, a couple things. One is, first of all, when you're about to die, and it's sort of God is decreeing that you're dying, I don't think there's a whole lot you can do about it, right? And then remember, there's all this midrash about Moses defying God. Remember, we read that a couple of times ago. There's all this midrash. I mean, it's not in the Torah, but in the certainly the rabbis agree with you. Like, no, I'm not, remember he draws a circle around himself and says, the angel of death is not coming in here. And he argues and he does all this stuff trying to stop this thing from happening. But yeah, Felice, you were going to say something?
To add insult to injury, and I'm sure the rabbis had a field day with the fact that vengeful God, has Moses looking at water, the Jordan River. And that must be, a heyday for rabbis translating that or interpreting that as part of the punishment of
Yeah, because the whole thing centered around getting water. The rabbis are not going to say that God is mean at all. They're going to say that Moses deserves this.
They're not going to say that he's a vengeful God.
No, I don't think, I mean, most of them are going to say that this is what Moses deserved. So what they'll do, like in the Talmud, okay, I'll tell you the story in the Talmud, which is really distressing. They're going to get close to maybe saying it, but they're never going to actually say it. So I think I've told you the story about how Moses is up in heaven with God, and God is writing the Torah. And remember, the Torah has little crowns on some of the letters.
Yes.
And, and Moses is going, wow, those are really beautiful. What are they? What do they mean? And God says, one day a sage is going to come along and interpret even the crowns on the letters. And Moses goes, wow, who's that sage? And Moses says, anybody remember who it is? It's Akiva. So God sends Moses into Akiva's academy, and he sits in the back and he's listening, and Akiva is expounding on the Torah, you know, all these interpretations. And Moses is having a really hard time following. He has no idea how this man has come up with all these interpretations. And finally, one of the students says, well, how do you know all this? Where does this come from? And Akiva says it comes from Moses. Excuse me. So this is the way the rabbis give themselves the permission to interpret, because they're saying it comes from Moses. In other words, these interpretations in the Talmud come from Mount Sinai also. The oral Torah also comes from Mount Sinai. It's not just the written Torah. And that's how they give themselves permission to do these interpretations. Anyway, Moses is very impressed, and he comes back to God and he goes, wow, that is amazing. This guy's incredible. What is the reward for somebody like this? And God points him to a scene of Akiva. Remember what happens to him under the Romans?
Yeah.
He
Killed.
gets killed.
Yeah,
Well, he's not only killed,
yeah,
they flay his
Again.
flesh.
yes.
And so they flayed his flesh and they're weighing it in the marketplace.
Oh.
And so Moses says, what is this? This is horrible. And God says, be quiet, such is my will.
Mhm.
In other words, yes, they're admitting that some things are really, really unfair. How can that be the fate of someone like Akiva? It's God's will. Shut up. Now, interestingly, when I was at Pardes in Jerusalem, which is a modern Orthodox adult study center, I had, most of the teachers are Orthodox. And I had this teacher who looked at all these stories and found justification for why this happened to Akiva. It was something like at one point, it was about, there's this rabbi who starts questioning whether God really exists. He's known as Acher, the other one. And he had been a teacher of Akiva's. And Akiva and all the other rabbis shunned him once he, they basically excommunicated him. And when he was dying, all the rabbis come to sort of pay their respects to him. And they kind of go, since we were really, disrespectful to you and everything else, are we going to be punished for this? And he says, yes, you will. And when it gets to Akiva, he says to Akiva, you're going to have the worst of it. So that's the rabbis justifying what happens to Akiva. So they can't turn around and say God is cruel. They just can't do it. Because how do you live in a world with a cruel God? They're saying God represents justice and truth and compassion. And yeah, God has some anger, right? Remember when God asks for, I think it's Elijah or somebody, one of the rabbis, he asked, please give me a blessing. What's the blessing he asked for? Please allow my compassion to overcome my anger, or my mercy to overcome my. So they get close to it, but they don't go all the way into saying anything that would disparage God, because they can't. So they find justifications for things. And if you can't figure it out, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud about Yisurin shel ahava. So the rabbis are saying, well, what happens if you are suffering and you can't figure out what you've done wrong? Well, you got to really examine your life and make sure you've studied enough Torah, and then make sure you've done enough acts of loving kindness, And if those things are not the problem, then they're yisurin shel ahava, they're tribulations out of love, that God gives you these trials and tribulations in a sense to test you, in a sense to purify you, in a sense to show other people who you are, what you're made of. And you're supposed to accept these tribulations out of love. Okay, that sounds pretty horrible, doesn't it?
Mhm.
What follows are 3 stories of rabbis who are ill, who are suffering. And each time a rabbi friend comes to them and says, are you accepting these tribulations out of love? And what do you think they say?
No.
They say no. So it's all well and good to have a wonderful philosophy or theology, but try living it sometimes. So they get close. It's sort of like Job, right? Job, the test is, will he curse God if everything's taken away from him, including his health? He never curses God, but he gets pretty close, right? He says, cursed is the day that I was born. I should never have been born. So they get as close as they can without actually doing it, because that's just too hard. It's just too hard. Hi,
Well,
Randy.
It makes God like the pagan gods. This is supposed to be a God of compassion, mercy, etc. He's supposed to be different than the other gods. And this vengeance, I mean, the gods just destroy you if you look at them cross-eyed, you know? And the gods that wipe out whole cities and have them burnt to the ground.
Right.
Makes
Well,
him almost human.
yeah. Well, here's the thing. Everybody has to remember that human beings wrote the Torah,
Mhm.
and that's how we understood God at that time. I don't think we necessarily understand God that way now. Sometimes we do. That's why the Unatana Tokef at the high holidays, as upsetting as it is, who shall live and who shall die, who by fire, who by water, even though it's upsetting, it may not be that God's doing these things, but these things happen. And so we have to face those things. Now, do you want to attribute them to God? If you do, then that's even more upsetting.
Mm.
Did God give you cancer as a punishment? I don't think that we believe in that kind of God. But we do have to face the fact that somebody's going to have cancer and someone else is going to have, another illness, and someone's going to die. And that's what we have to face in the year to come. Of course, this year more than ever, unfortunately. But yeah, the rabbis don't, to them, the Torah was written by God, right? Moses took dictation from God.
Yeah.
So of course, they're not going to understand God as being vengeful. They're going to see God as God of judgment. This is what you get for misbehaving. And you know what? This is the last Torah portion that we read every week. This is where we end. During the weekly Torah portions. The last Torah portion that we're going to look at now is what we read at Simchat Torah, but we don't read it, in a week during the weekly cycle. So this is where we're ending it. Poor Moses looking across from Mount Nebo at the promised land that he'll never enter. So that's an existential statement, if there ever was one, right? The whole Torah ends without our entering the promised land, and we've talked a little bit about that and what that represents as an existential statement. But here's a very personal one with a man who spent 40 years, not only 40 years taking people through the desert, but how about facing the Pharaoh, his stepfather, or step-grandfather rather, his step-grandfather. He's had to face, he grew up in the palace, right? The princess was his foster mother or adoptive mother. He didn't know. Maybe he knew that that wasn't his real mother. Maybe he didn't. And there was Pharaoh, his grandfather. And he basically has to turn around and say, hey, we got to go.
Let my people go.
Yeah. So that's already a lot right there. And then taking these complaining people through the desert and rebellious people through the desert for 40 years. And now he's at Mount Nebo looking and knowing he's about to die too. You know, he's not just, oh, you know, you get to have a beautiful home up here and you can look across and see the promised land. It's like, you are also dying right now. What a message. But that's for everybody, right? We're all looking at the promised land, right? We never get there and we're going to die. So that's the way it is. So we're going to move on to the next Torah portion.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
a question. Um, Is Mary, what happened to Miriam? Is
she died.
she
Remember, she
with-
died a while back. And remember, the Midrash says that she's the source of the water. And they're out of water when she dies. Thus the need to hit the rock. When she's around, there's water. And when she's not there, there's no more water. But
so
she died and Aaron died.
died in the desert
Hmm.
or before in the desert.
Yeah,
And Aaron has died.
yes.
So, and we don't know what happened to Zipporah.
That's an excellent question. No, they never bothered to tell us what happens to Zipporah.
Hmm.
And actually, what's going to be interesting about what we're about to read is that the final Torah portion, which, as I said, is only read at Simchat Torah, not in the cycle during the year, is Moses's sort of blessings or predictions about the different tribes, which is very parallel to the Torah portion that starts this afternoon, which is Jacob doing that for his sons, who are the, you know, eponyms of the tribes. Does he offer a blessing for his daughter Dinah? Nope,
No,
not a mention. And here, as you said, where's Zipporah? Where are the kids?
the rabbis concentrate on the male side.
Which is why we have to resurrect the poor women.
That's true.
Wasn't Zipporah a Midianite and therefore a foreigner, and the redactors of the Torah just kind of dropped her because she was a foreigner?
Yeah, well, all of these wives are so-called foreigners. None of them are Israelites, right? I mean, all the matriarchs come from Haran, right?
Mhm.
And so they're technically not Israelites, which is why in the Torah, it's patrilineal descent,
Mhm.
right? It's who your father is. It tells you whether or not you're an Israelite, not who your mother is. It's during the period of the,
Change.
When did it change?
it changed during the period of the Mishnah, which was edited in 200 CE. And it was, the speculation is that it was as a result of the war against the Romans, when a lot of women were raped by Roman soldiers. So you don't want to have all these so-called bastards or, you know, kids that aren't part of the community. So they changed it. You definitely know who the mother is. You don't know who the father is necessarily. So we're gonna, yeah. All right, we're gonna go on to read the next. Let's see, I gotta move it to the next chapter. How do I get there? Where is the arrow to move it to the next chapter? There it is. Okay.
These aren't in our handouts, right, Rabbi?
This is the actual biblical material. So if you have a Bible, you can follow along. All right. So now Moses, this is his really final speech. So would somebody like to read?
I will.
Thank you.
This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, pronounced on the Israelites before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came with myriads of holy ones from the south, from his mountain slopes. Surely it is you who love the people. All the holy ones are in your hand. At your feet they all bow down, and from you they receive instruction. The law that Moses gave us, the possession of the assembly of Jacob, he was king over
Jeshurun, which is basically Israel.
when the leaders of the people assembled along with the tribes of Israel. Let Reuben live and not die, nor his people be few. And this he said about Judah. Hear, Lord, the cry of Judah. Bring him to his people. With his own hands he defends his cause. Oh, be his help against his foes.
Okay, I'm going to just stop you for 1 second. I just want to read you here. Those first couple of verses describe the approach of God from the wilderness region south of the promised land. The text bristles with difficulties, but similar descriptions in other biblical poems show its approximate meaning. These picture God coming from the southern wilderness and mountains like Sinai, Seir, Edom, Teman, Mount Paran, to deliver God's people. Leading God's heavenly army, God rides on a chariot in a tempest, weapons flashing like lightning. God is surrounded by a brilliant radiance and accompanied by supernatural holy beings and by pestilence and plague. In God's path, the earth quakes, the heavens rain, and fire blazes. God treads the earth and tramples nations. These descriptions do not refer to the covenant and law-giving that took place at Mount Sinai, but to God's coming from the Sinai region to aid Israel against its enemies. So this is, God delivering the people as opposed to the vengeful God. This is interesting. This is also, of course, based on scholarly material. That some evidence suggests that God's base was in the southern wilderness in the period preceding the Exodus in the 13th century. Okay, why is this doing this? Okay. Okay, so this suggests, that our God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, maybe came from the southern region and then was adopted by all of Israel, which is kind of interesting because, of course, we don't think of our God being from a specific region.
But that was the region that the J redactor
Yes,
came from.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
it's the southern region that that survives after the Assyrian destruction of the 10 tribes.
Absolutely, yes.
So it makes sense.
Yes,
Historically,
Judah
it
is the
makes
last
sense.
tribe standing,
Yeah.
and therefore is the one who wrote the history. And maybe the one that influenced, the whole people the most, right?
Mhm.
So,
Rabbi, what did you say about the 13th century? During
13th
the
century
plague?
BCE, I got interrupted by something that appeared on my
Oh,
screen.
BCE,
Yeah.
or the comment, okay.
Yeah, the Bible refers to Sinai Horeb several times as the mountain of God or the mountain of the Lord, once even before God's appearance to Moses at the burning bush, implying that the site was already a holy place.
Mm. What book are you reading from?
This is the JPS Torah commentary, and this one's Deuteronomy from Tigay.
Okay.
And interesting, Egyptian inscriptions of the 14th century refer to a land of the nomads, Yahweh. Apparently in the same region, Yahweh could be an Egyptian transcription of Hebrew Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Lord. It's the name of God, right? And the Egyptian phrase means either the land of the nomads of the place called Yahweh or the land of the nomads who worship Yahweh. So this is very early on that there's already this concept of this God named Yahweh or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So all this suggests that there were sanctuaries and worshipers, not necessarily Israelites, of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh in the Sinai Negev wilderness, perhaps as early as the 14th or 15th century BCE, and that this region may have been the main center of God's worship at that time. So apparently there was this God named Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh that was worshiped way before the Israelites even came into the promised land. And that's the God that got adopted by the Israelites. I mean, that's a speculation. Who knows? Who knows? But that's the implication of this beginning here, that God is coming from the south. And that's where the worship of this particular God originated.
Like an idol?
Yeah, like there, as I've mentioned before, we went from a belief in many gods, polytheism, and we didn't go right away to monotheism. We went through something called, well, this is, again, scholarly speculation. We went through something called monolatry, which means that there's an understanding that there are a lot of gods, but ours is the best or the strongest or whatever. And you see remnants of this in the 10 Commandments. You shall not bow down to other gods. Well, what other gods? Or the Michamocha, who is like you, Adonai, among the gods? It's all left over from that. And this is left over too, because we're saying this God came from the south.
And El came from the north. So when you see Elohim or El or El Shaddai, that's all northern. That's all from the E-redactor who comes from the north.
Good, good.
And
right.
the speculation is, or the current thought is, that during the destruction of the first temple, I don't remember if it's the destruction of the first temple or the Assyrian onslaught, many northerners fled to the south. And that's how the E version combines with the J version, which means that there's another redactor over those two that are going to bring the two different views of God together.
So for those who don't know what Jane is talking about, so this is the, no, I mean, we've talked about it, but it was a long time ago. This is the documentary hypothesis that there were 4 main sources for the Bible, for the Torah anyway.
Yeah, for the
So
Torah.
there's J, where God is referred to as Yud He Vav He, which is from the south. Then there's E, where, as Jane said, God is referred to as Elohim or El. There's D, which is Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy that was discovered under King Josiah in the 600s BCE. And by the way, was authenticated by a woman named Huldah, a prophetess. And then there's P, the priestly version, which is supposedly the writer of the very first story in Bereshit, in Genesis, the story of creation, the first one, and the book of Leviticus, and possibly was also doing some editing of the other material. And then, yeah, somebody probably took J and E and put them together, and then someone put all of it together. They think maybe it was Ezra, who's the editor, while he was in Babylonia, who brought it back to Israel when he came to Israel. So the south, which is where Judah was, clearly, you know, if this is true, if the speculation is true that Yud He Vav He came from the south and was one of the various gods, then Judah would have brought that God forward as the main God. And then that was adopted by Israel. But we have all these other references to how God is referred to. So if you're Orthodox, you say, of course, there aren't 4 sources. There's one, it's God. Why is God referred to as Elohim in one place and Yud He Vav He in another? Because those are different aspects of God. But if you're a scholar, you'll say, oh, well, the people who refer to God as Elohim came from the north, and their story was merged into the larger story because we don't want to toss anybody's history out. We want everyone to feel that they're part of this, or who knows what the reason was, because we don't know.
Is the concept of God by these different writers, human God is human-like, coming from a land?
Well, of course, yeah, a lot of the description of God sounds very human because that's all we know, right? It's very
not from a spiritual or a mystical.
Well,
God.
I think, first of all, the only language we have is human language. So does God hear? Does God see? But that's how we describe God, because that's all we know is that kind of language and those kinds of characteristics. And remember, Hebrew is a very concrete language and, you know, kind of thought. So everything is written in a very concrete way, even if it's expressing something more abstract.
And like Spanish and Romance languages, it's a noun as a he or she.
Yeah, it's gendered. there are people working on
which is
ungendering it.
Gender.
Yeah, it's gendered. So God is
Oh.
definitely he in the Bible. And actually, I had a big discussion with Marcia Falk about this a couple of weeks ago, because Marcia Falk, as some of you know, is a liturgist and a poet. And she's written alternative blessings, the ones that we traditionally use. And she's writing a Haggadah. And she sent me a copy of some of the material she wrote, and her translation of the Bible or of the Torah was very gendered. You know, God referred to as he, and I wrote some comments about it. And she said, that's what the language in Hebrew is. And so you can't, you know, mess with it. And my Bible teacher, Dr. Tamara Eskenazi, whom some of you have met, she would fine us if we said he for God. And so that was battered into my head to the point where I always what I just read to you now was not written God, it was he, but I keep changing it. But Marcia feels like, well, that's what it says, and that's what you're dealing with. And in fact, you guys will be interested in her Haggadah, because she is talking about the vengeful God. And, you know, in the story of the Exodus, I mean, the horrible things that God does, right? And so she's talking about it. Well, it has to be a he God, because it's that, you know, kind of patriarchal, masculine, whatever. So we had a big discussion about that. But apparently, because I made that comment, she's going to explain why she translated it that way. Because at first she said, you misunderstood what I said. Ugh, how could I misunderstand, Marcia Falk? Oh dear, I better, you know. But I explained to her about Dr. Eskenazi. Dr. Eskenazi's wrong. Okay, that's what scholars do. They argue with each other. Yes, Jason.
Well,
Oh, sorry. Sandy and then
like
Jason.
Why
go
Dr.
ahead.
Ashkenazi want you to use it instead of he?
God, or, you know, listen, in the
Oh,
in
God.
the prayer book, you do
Okay.
not see, our prayer book, you do not see God referred to as he ever. Sometimes they say you, that's a way to turn it around. Or God, they don't use the Lord either. And her translation of the Torah in the Women's Torah commentary doesn't refer to God either. I think they use the eternal or something. And then when you see Adonai, instead of saying the Lord, which is what it means, my Lord, it's just left as Adonai. That way you don't have to struggle.
You know that is true in the candle blessing for Shabbat. I left out the word Lord and just said God.
Good
I don't
for you.
know. Well, I mean, in the book, it says the Lord, our God. And I just said,
I guess it depends on, let me look at our
well, actually, I used this. I don't think it was in our prayer book that
I doubt it's in our prayer book because it's fairly new, but let me I'm going to double check and see what it says.
well, the one that I used was actually printed in Israel.
Yeah, well, let's see. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God. Don't translate Adonai, because then you'd have to say what it really is. Sovereign of the universe. See, they don't, even though the Hebrew says melech, which means king.
King.
Sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the lights of Shabbat. And so commanding us is also a way to get around it, because, well, I mean, you don't have to translate it as he, but the
Either
verbs are
he enlightened us with his commandments.
That's a nice one. I like that. Jason, did you want to?
Well, I was thinking through all of this about how the Shema is maybe in a bit of an attempt to reconcile all of this, and just to say God is one takes away any geography, any gender. It allows us to see it all as encompassing everything, and not to be trying to break down and define God with these other more limiting characteristics.
Yeah. Well, you know, there are people who are working on ungendering, or however the verb would be, the Hebrew language. So for example, our educator, who is a young woman, Andrea, she's 29. So in the morning when she teaches the kids about the prayers, for example, Modeh Ani, which means you thank God in the morning when you wake up, right? So Modeh is the masculine. And moda is the feminine. So she says, if you're a girl, you say moda. If you're a boy, you say modeh. And if you're neither, or I don't remember exactly how she characterizes it, she says you say modet. So modet is an attempt to take both the feminine and the masculine ending and make it non-binary. So yes, we are in a new world of many new genders, although frankly, Judaism has like 6 genders traditionally, you know, so that's nothing new. And I think Native American cultures have more genders than 2.
Can you show us
Yeah,
that?
two-spirit is a whole group. Two-spirit is the term they use.
What, Jane, what were you asking for?
I said, I always thought that Judaism was either male or female, that they didn't recognize the other genders. So where do you find that?
Okay, I need to, let me find my
You did a
file.
great talk all about this, and you showed us all the source materials that talked about the legal determinations, right? That there were
Thank
times
you.
when there were questions of inheritance or who had to perform which commandments and who didn't.
Yeah,
There
let
was
me
one
see.
called like Timtum or something, right?
Yeah,
It was one.
yeah. Let me just find what. Then I have to remember where I filed it.
Oh, just do it. Just send me an email.
Okay.
You know, don't take up time from Torah study for a question like that. I'm amazed. I think it's
Oh, here it is.
the conservative Orthodox influence on me. But that's wonderful to know. I would really like to put that into my memory bank.
You know, I will. No, I found it. I just I need to. I'll share it with you for a moment, just because as long as we're talking about all of this, might as well take a look at it. But I just have to.
My mind, I never heard this concept of 6 sexes, but I'm thinking in modern terms, the LGBT, are there 6 sexes in those, the designation of binary and queer? Is there only 6? I mean, are we
Oh no, no.
on a continuum
Oh, here, this is
of
one of them.
gender
Okay.
where there's multiple sexes?
Okay. Let me just share this. Share screen. Okay. Why doesn't it want to do
Yeah,
this?
and
Okay.
I agree with Jane. If you want to move on,
Yeah.
we've got distracted.
Okay, I did find it, but now trying to share it doesn't seem to be an easy thing to do.
Just
Let's
let
see.
it go.
Oh, here, can you see it? Oh, there it is. Okay. See it? Terms for gender
Yeah.
diversity in Jewish sacred texts.
Ah,
Okay, so you have Zachar, which is masculine, Nekeva, which is feminine, androgynous, which is both male and female. Tumtum, indeterminate sexuality.
mhm.
Ilonit, a person who's identifies as female at birth but develops male characteristics. And Saris, a person who's identified as male at birth but develops female characteristics at puberty or later.
Very confusing.
Is that transgender?
I'd say that's more like non-binary.
Oh,
I don't know. It depends. But anyway, so these are the terms in the Talmud, just to see that there are other designations.
They say in the medical literature that about 1 in 10,000 births is actually indistinguishable at birth, but almost every culture just assigns one or the other,
Interesting.
often wrong. And so this almost seems to be a reality check of that they used to understand that that happened, and that someone might be brought up as one or the other, and then at puberty they realize they made a mistake, and they're almost acknowledging it in the law.
Okay, so now back to the Torah. So we have, so this is what is said about Judah, right? Judah is the tribe that is still standing right in the history. So it's the first one that appears here, as you can see. And by the way, if you happen to come to our service at Christmas, which is this coming Friday, I'm talking about a little bit about Jacob's blessings for the different sons, and Judah and Joseph are both privileged in his blessings as well. Same reason. Who comes out of the tribe of Judah, by the way?
Benjamin.
Who's the really important person that comes out of, or actually more than one person, who comes out of the tribe of Judah, or which characters that are really important?
Is it King David?
King David.
Yeah.
When you're the winner, you get to decide how the Messiah is going to come around, right? And Abraham is also from that tribe. Okay.
So we're talking about Ruth and Naomi.
Well, Ruth is a Moabite, so she's not from any of these tribes, but her husband is. Okay, does somebody want to pick up about Levi? Now, Tumim and Urim, by the way, are the, they're almost like dice that the high priest has. They're little stones that the high priest will throw to figure out, like, you know, what's coming up. You know, it's obviously completely opposite to what our religion's all about, that you would actually throw any kind of stones and try to figure out, you know, what to do. But there's some leftovers from earlier religion, as you can see.
Maybe the dreidel.
The dreidel, there you go. Doug, you want to read?
Yes, I certainly can. Hold on just a second.
Can you see it enough?
I can. I'm just, my computer was acting a little bizarre.
Oh, sorry.
All right, no worries. So about Levi, he said, your Thummim and Urim belong to your faithful servant. You tested him at Massah. You contended with him at the waters of Meribah. He said of his father and mother, I have no regard for them. He did not recognize his brothers or acknowledge his own children, but he watched over your word and guarded your covenant. He teaches your precepts to Jacob and law to Israel. He offers incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. Bless all his skills, Lord, and he pleased and be pleased with the work of his hands. Strike down those who rise against him, his foes, till they rise no more.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop 1 second. Here's a better way to explain the Tumim and Urim. They were a device for obtaining God's decision on important questions. As I said, very, very much not like what we're supposed to do, but hey, you know, leftovers from the earlier religion. And Levi, of course, is the tribe of the priests, right? And that's why they mention the Tumim and Urim here. Okay, let's go down to Benjamin.
About Benjamin, he said, let the beloved of the Lord rest secure in him, for he shields him all day long, and the one the Lord loves rests between his shoulders. About Joseph, he said, may the Lord bless his land with the precious dew from heaven above, and with the deep waters that lie below, with the best the sun brings forth, and the finest the moon can yield, with the choicest gifts of the ancient mountains, and the fruitlessness of everlasting hills, and the best gifts of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the burning bush. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. In majesty, he is like a firstborn bull. His horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he will gore the nations, even at the ends of the earth, such as the 10,000 of Ephraim, such as 1,000 at Manasseh.
So Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's two sons who are actually going to get the land, as opposed to there's no. Yeah. And remember, by the way, when we bless our children on Shabbat, we want the women to be like, you know, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, the matriarchs, Rachel and Leah. But for the sons, we want them to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And there's a question about that, which I talk about on Friday. I will talk about on Friday, but if you're not going to be there, there are a lot of possible reasons for why we do Ephraim and Manasseh and not, you know, Jacob and Isaac and Abraham.
Hmm.
Any ideas? Why do you think we bless our, and we don't know why, because nobody left notes. So all you can do is speculate. Why we,
I think it's because they're the only two brothers that don't try to kill each other.
hey, excellent. Very good. Very good. That's one of the reasons that was, at least thrown out by the Etz Chaim commentary, that all the other brothers either, try to kill each other or do kill each other, or certainly don't like get along too well. And these two, we never hear that they fight.
They don't-
Any
they
other
don't- They don't try to
reasons?
kill each other, huh?
Yeah. They're also kind
You
of on
get
the,
the A, Jane.
yeah. So they're also kind of between being completely Israelites and being completely Egyptians, right? I mean, they're born in Egypt, and when Manasseh is born, Joseph says he's naming him in honor of forgetting his past. Really rejecting your past. And Joseph certainly is very assimilated into the Egyptian culture. On the other hand, he's also still an Israelite, clearly, but he's kind of on the edge of both, as are his sons. So it's that balancing act of trying to be both, of trying to live in modern society and yet also being, different. Who knows if those are the reasons that they were picked, but the rabbis didn't leave us notes. So anyway, all right, let's go back to, where is my,
Well, Joseph really became an Egyptian. I mean, he assumed, even though he knew where he came from, I mean, in all the things that he did, he lived as an Egyptian, right?
he did. And as I said last night, based on Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I believe, you have to also be able to navigate in that world, right? If you want to get something done. Like the Israelites would have starved to death if Joseph hadn't been there to give them food.
Right.
And he knew how to, work the system, shall we say. But he still, admitted that he was Joseph and that he's an Israelite, and he brought his family in, and he wanted to be buried in Israel, right? So he was both, as we all are here, right? We're all pretty much assimilated into the larger culture, and yet we identify strongly as Jews. I mean, going to Torah study is one of the most basic ways of identifying as a Jew. And, we go to services and, we're proud to be Jewish, but we also have to be able to navigate in the outside world, or the non-Jewish world.
Well, don't forget, I mean, the flip is Moses, who was raised Egyptian.
Absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
Israelites. So it's the opposite of Joseph there, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So we have both in our as our
History.
figures we can look at.
Yes. Who have successfully navigated both. Although I'm not sure Moses did it so successfully. Because it's not like he just went up to his step grandfather and said, "Hey, Grandpa, do you mind letting us out of here?" It wasn't so easy, and it was a bloody night that they finally were able to leave.
Well, it wasn't so easy for Joseph either. So, I mean,
Yeah, he was in jail for a long time. Right, he almost was killed many times. Actually, many times, because first his brothers were going to kill him, then in jail. Well, Mrs. Potiphar, got him in trouble. And, he might have languished in jail if was it the cupbearer? I can never remember which one of the two remembered him and brought him to Pharaoh. Okay, so we're going to read some more.
Rabbi, do you know if Joseph is as revered as in the
As
Quran?
Moses?
As
who?
Moses?
As Moses?
As Moses, or
No.
as some of the other, not at all. Okay.
No, not, I mean, Moses is Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Or Rabbi Moses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and Abraham and right.
I mean, let's
But not
face it,
Joseph.
Joseph was a bit of a spoiled brat, if you recall. Although I read a brilliant drosh
He was the
by,
youngest.
I read a
He was the
brilliant,
youngest.
he was the second youngest. Benjamin was the youngest, but he was the youngest when he was a spoiled brat. Okay, now I'm blanking on his last name. So before I'll find his name. Michael Strassfeld, yes, Rabbi Michael Strassfeld. So he wrote about how so many of our patriarchs were basically binary. You know, everything was black and white, but Joseph saw nuance and variety, and that is symbolized by his coat of many colors. And I can't like really, without reading it and looking at it again, I can't really do justice to this drosh, but the idea that he was able to, you know, navigate in both
Negotiate.
worlds and see more opportunities and possibilities rather than just black and white. It was brilliant when I read it, but not when I'm recounting it. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's go back here. And so let's read about Zebulun. These are all the tribes, remember.
About Zebulun, he said, rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and you, Issachar, in your tents. They will summon peoples to the mountain, and there offer the sacrifices of the righteous. They will feast on the abundances of the sea, on the treasures hidden in the sand. About Gad, he said, blessed is he who enlarges Gad's domain. Gad lives there like a lion, tearing at arm or head. He chose the best land for himself. The leader's portion was kept for him. When the heads of the people assembled, he carried out the Lord's righteous will and his judgments concerning Israel. About Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's cub springing out of Bashan. About Naphtali, he said, Naphtali is abounding with the favor of the Lord and is full of his blessing. He will inherit southward to the lake. About Asher, he said, most blessed of sons is Asher. Let him be favored by his brothers, and let him bathe his feet in oil. The bolts of your gates will be iron and bronze, and your strength will equal your days. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides across the heavens to help you, and on the clouds in his majesty. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath all the everlasting arms. He will drive out your enemies before you, saying, destroy them. So Israel will live in safety. Jacob will dwell secure in a land of grain and new wine, where the heavens drop dew. Blessed are you, Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord. He is your shield and helper and your glorious sword. Your enemies will come before you, and you will tread on their heights.
Thank you. Okay, I found the thing that Michael Strassfeld wrote, so I have to share it because I really did not do justice to his wonderful drosh. Okay, God created the world with light and darkness, differentiated but mixed together as well, creating a world of shadows. Sometimes it can be difficult to see clearly. There's a strong temptation as we strive for clarity to label what we see as either light or as darkness. The book of Genesis is replete with those who think it is necessary to choose only one, Isaac and not Ishmael, Jacob and not Esau, the offerings of Abel over that of Cain. Through these binary choices, jealousy, hatred, and even fratricide come into the world. Joseph is different. He seems to have an inner light. Joseph doesn't at first understand the need for shadow or shadings. Arrogantly telling his brothers his dreams, he sets in motion the events that will plunge him into the darkness of one pit after another, until he is called into the light of day as the vizier of Egypt. Joseph is a dream interpreter, Hine Baal Halamot, as his brothers call him on that fateful day. Joseph sees clearly in the interplay between light and darkness. Unlike every other character in his story, his brothers, his father, or Potiphar, he cannot be deceived. Who better to interpret dreams, the place of the intersection of the conscious and the unconscious, in which everything is covered with a veil of darkness and confusion? Joseph sees the light amidst the shadows. It is not surprising that when his brothers first appear in Egypt, he recognizes them and they don't recognize him. Joseph still sees them as his brothers, despite everything they have done to him. He tells them that being sold into slavery and all that follows was for a purpose, to bring his whole family to safety in Egypt. Of all the rivalries of Genesis, he's the only one who can clearly and honestly forgive those who have wronged him. He's not a worshiper of the idols of past grievances. He is ready to move on. It is Joseph's story we are to carry with us from Genesis, perhaps even more than that of the patriarchs. Theirs is a narrow vision that causes them to divide the world into white and black, into chosen and unchosen. Joseph lives in technicolor and thus embraces all of his brothers. We too are dreamers living in the courts of Pharaoh. Hanukkah reminds us that we too have an inner light that is with us even in the darkest pits. We too can find forgiveness and reconciliation. We too can see clearly amidst the shadows of this world. We too can make manifest the idea that life is a coat of many colors and thereby echo his words to everyone. I am Joseph, your brother.
Could you send that to us?
Sure.
Yes, please, with the
Isn't that
name of
beautiful?
the author, please.
Yeah, Michael Strassfeld. Yeah, I will definitely send it to you. Really beautiful, especially when you're talking about Vayigash, which is when Joseph reveals himself,
Mhm.
is, yeah, next week's Torah portion. And Hanukkah just ended, and we were talking about Joseph, so it seemed like an opportune moment to talk about that, you know, that it's not about, is it
Yeah.
Ishmael or Isaac? Is it Jacob or Esau? You know, why is it one or the other? Or, you know, I'm angry at you, therefore you're my enemy. How about reconciliation and understanding and all of that? So it's a beautiful message. So let's go back to our tribes. Now I have to find the arrow again so I can,
Mm.
there we go. Just want to get rid of all this stuff on the side. Okay, there we go. All right, we're almost done. Now, here we are. We've just had all these so-called blessings, right? Not so much blessings, but I mean, they were nice blessings compared to what Jacob says to his kids. But now we're going to go to the end. Who wants to read this?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel.
Okay, that is the actual ending of the Torah. And when we complete a book of the Torah, we say, you can repeat after me, Chazak,
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 v'nitchazek.
Nit Chazek.
So let us be strengthened by the power of the Torah. So this is unbelievable that it's only been 9 years and 11 months or 11 weeks. I don't know. Lynn's
Lynn
been,
knows. Lynn always knows.
Lynn knows. Yeah, she's over 9 years.
9
right,
years
so-
and 3 months right now.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. All right, so let's just take a look at a couple things here. First of all, Moses dies. So here's a big question. How did he write about his death?
Because there's no time in the Torah.
Ah, okay.
Also, it
Well-
says he buried him. Who buried Moses? God buried
God.
Moses?
God. All right, so we don't know where he's
And we don't
buried,
know
which is
where
very
he's
important.
buried.
Huh?
We know where Abraham is buried. We know where a lot of other people are buried,
Yes.
but not Moses.
Because we don't want to turn him into a god. Because the question that Felice asked is, is Joseph as revered as Moses? No, Moses is revered probably the most of anybody, and we don't want to turn him into a god. By the way, remember the Haggadah does not mention Moses's name. And he's the one who made everything happen. So we don't know where he's buried. God buried him, but there were some like Ibn Ezra, who's one of the commentators in the Middle Ages, was like, okay, these last 10 verses, how was it that they were written by Moses? Or the last few verses, from 5 to 12, 7 verses. How was he able to write about his death? How could he have done that? Well, so some people say, well, Joshua wrote those last few verses, or, maybe God dictated to him how he was going to die. Who knows? But it certainly started raising some questions about who could have written this. And of course, there was no prophet who's risen in Israel like Moses, whom God knew face to face. Remember, God said, you can't know me face to face. Remember that God said, when Moses said, let me please see your face, what does God say to him?
Turn your back.
Yeah.
Get in the
away.
rock and look at my back,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So interesting that it says there was nobody like Moses who arose knowing God face to face. The last word of the Torah is Yisrael.
Mm.
Okay, so let's quickly look at the commentary that I shared with you. This is from Jim Orens, who used to do, where is it? Here it is. Who used to do a commentary basically like all the time, right? He would, let me just get rid of this.
Yeah,
Jim
that
used
was
to every
very good.
week.
He used to send it to everyone. Well,
Yes,
not everyone.
Yes, he used to do a Torah commentary every week, and usually with extensive amount of research. And then he got busy, and now he's semi-retired, and I guess he's doing other things.
You don't put the license plate Devar Man on your car unless
Oh,
you
right.
really are committed.
Right.
Oh,
So,
it used to be great.
yeah, no, I have all the things that he sent since I was here, but. So he says from Rabbi Avi Weiss, the last portion of the Torah reverberates with the image of circles. After all, immediately after its reading, we start the Torah from the beginning again. As I said, this is the last Torah. Normally for Simchat Torah, we don't exactly do that here. Jim actually usually reads the last few lines, but you usually read the whole Torah portion. And then you start all over again with Bereshit, right? So it's this continuous circle. And interestingly, yeah, Jim's the one who usually reads during our Simchat Torah, the last few lines of this Torah portion. So we read it on Simchat Torah, the holiday when we dance in circles, lovingly embracing the Torah as we joyously celebrate the cycle of public Torah reading. The first vizot in the Torah, and all first set the standard, speaks of the blessing Jacob gave his sons. Remember, I said this is very parallel to the Torah portion where Jacob is blessing his sons. There, vizot refers to the cycle of life as Yaakov implores his sons to follow in his footsteps, and he asks that he be returned to be buried with his ancestors. And when the Torah wrapped around its circular wooden poles is lifted, we declare vizot HaTorah. That's what we say every time, we've done a Torah service, and then we lift it, right? Vizot HaTorah, Asher, Moshe, etc. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, bade the Israelites farewell before he died. Rashi, as usual, notices every word in our parsha. Here he picks up an apparently unnecessary phrase, before he died. After all, could Moses have blessed the people after his death? Rashi says, based on earlier sources, before his death, before, which in Hebrew is lifnei, means close to his death. For if not now, when? Who said that?
Well,
Rabbi Hillel, if I'm only for myself, who will be? If I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm for myself only, what am I? And if not now, when? This harkens back to a statement, here, from Rabbi Hillel. Okay, a sense of urgency. Likewise, Moses knows the time has come to die, and with urgency speaks his final words of wisdom to his people. The only tribe that does not receive a blessing is Shimon, because they were central to the mass immorality of worshiping the idol at Baal Peor. Remember what happened at Baal Peor? What happened there? Anybody remember?
No.
This is when Pinchas came and skewered a couple of people, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Pouring around with the wrong women, the Midianite women, right? And Pinchas came and speared them, and thus was given the covenant of peace.
Not for them.
Yeah. Another explanation given is that this tribe's population was small and scattered throughout the south of the land of Israel, and would therefore receive blessings together with the host tribe amongst whom they would live, i.e. Judah. There it is again. Moses commanded us a law, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. Here, Rabbi Neil Lovinger says that Moses is mentioning his own role in the people's history, claiming that the Torah was commanded by Moshe, although it came from God. Even though he was called a very humble man, he had every right to remind the people of what he actually did. Perhaps this gave his blessings more legitimacy and his words greater power. Moshe spoke out of a sense of urgency, a sense of truthfulness, and a legitimate desire for recognition of his real contributions. Thus, Moshe's final blessing also becomes his final moment of teaching us by the example of his life, a life dedicated to ideals, actions, and truth. That's what makes him Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, not just Moshe the leader. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, etc., which we just read. And no one knows, okay, so from this verse, we're taught that Moses dies after the, quote, divine kiss. How is this derived? Because we hear all the time that Moses died because God kissed him. Because in Hebrew, this business of at the command of the Lord is al pi Adonai, and pi means mouth. So this is what these guys always do. They take something like the Israelites are standing at the foot of the mountain, which in Hebrew is tachtav, under the mountain, and they say, aha, the mountain was being held over their heads. Here, al pi Adonai, which technically means at the command of God, and you would never guess from looking at the English how the rabbis say that Moses died by a kiss from God. You have to know the Hebrew. Vayamat sham Moshe eved Adonai be'eretz Moav al pi Adonai. And Moses, that's the darkened Hebrew. And Moses, well, he died there, Moses, the servant of God, in the land of Moab, by the mouth of God. So therefore, God kissed him, which is a very sweet and poignant way for Moses to die.
So like the kiss of death.
Yes, unfortunately, it's also like the kiss of death. Good. The fact that the Torah ends with Moses' death presents a big problem for many commentators, because there's a line of thinking in traditional Jewish theology that says the Torah was dictated word for word to Moses on Mount Sinai, or at least that Moses himself wrote the Torah. If so, how could the Torah say that Moses died? Who then wrote the last few lines of the Torah? This is not only a modern concern. The Talmud records an argument about this problem from the very earliest days of post-biblical Judaism. Rabbi Lovinger helps us understand the issues. The master has said, Joshua wrote the book which bears his name in the last 8 verses of the Pentateuch. The statement is in agreement with the authority who says that 8 verses of the Torah were written by Joshua. It was actually 8 verses. I said it was 7, but 5 to 7 includes an extra verse. Yeah. Now, is it possible that Moses, being dead, could have written the words Moses died there? The truth is, however, that up to this point, Moses wrote. From this point onwards, Joshua wrote. This is the opinion of Rabbi Judah, or according to others, of Rabbi Nehemiah. Said Rabbi Simeon to him, can we imagine the scroll of the law being short of one word? No. What we must say is that up to this point where Moses died, the Holy One, blessed be God, dictated, and Moses repeated and wrote. And from this point, God dictated and Moses wrote with tears. In other words, God dictated the actual death of Moses. And so Moses is writing it crying. Then Baruch answered them, he pronounced all these words to me with his mouth, and I wrote them with ink in the book. So they're taking Jeremiah's lines to explain it. Yet at least one commentator makes an even more dramatic midrash on the midrash. Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, an early medieval commentator from Spain, also known as the Rashba, takes Rabbi Shimon's interpretation even further by understanding the words, and Moses wrote with tears in the most literal sense. The Rashba says that Moses used his own tears as the ink with which he wrote the last few verses of the Torah. To this day, when no one knows the place of his burial, in order that Moses' grave should not become a shrine for those who wish to make a prophet into a god, even though we know that some of the Kabbalists actually go to the cemetery and throw themselves on the graves of their Rebbe. And a bit of midrash, God buried him in the valley of Moab. Moses deserved the honor of having God perform his burial because the midrash says, during the exodus from Egypt, when everyone else was looking for gold and silver, Moses was looking for the coffin of Joseph. Now remember, Joseph wants to be buried in the land. And when Moses found it, he carried it on his own shoulders. Thus, Moses helped to fulfill the oath made to Joseph in Genesis. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, you shall carry my bones from here. The honor and respect that Moses paid to Joseph's last wish to be buried with his ancestors are rewarded when God buries Moses, a singular divine act. There are many midrashim that describe Moses' last moments on earth. Some tell of how Moses tried many different ways to plead with God to let it enter the promised land, including having himself turned into an animal so he could enter it in some form. And we read that a few weeks ago. The Sefer HaAgadah, the book of legends, relates the following midrash. Moses went over to Joshua and asked, what did the word say to you, meaning God? And Joshua replied, when the word used to reveal itself to you, did I know what it said to you? In other words, hey, I'm in charge now. I don't have to share my secrets with you. You didn't share yours with me. In that instant, Moses cried out in anguish and said, rather 100 deaths than a single pang of envy. Mastered the universe until now I sought life, but now my soul is surrendered to you. So that was one of the stories we read, is that once Moses started feeling jealous, he realized that was it. It was time to go, because jealousy is a very, very bad thing. So, folks, we have finished the Torah. Who was there from the beginning? Lynn, Jason, Sandy, Ruth, and Susie, you were there from the beginning, weren't you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys were there from way, way back. Okay, so this is amazing. Now,
We get a prize.
in heaven, in the world to come.
Don't go yet, Sandy.
I might
Yeah.
have been there.
I'm trying not to.
When you start, suffering tribulations and you have to examine whether or not you studied enough Torah, you can tell yourself you did.
But talk about a leap of faith. I mean, we all just started showing up and we didn't have any idea what the length of the journey would be. And, it was just an opportunity. And, once you get yourself a little invested in something, you don't want to stop. So it became almost like this became the thing that I circled on my calendar, and this is sacred. You don't schedule anything on these
That's
mornings.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So my proposal is that we proceed with the book of Joshua, because that is definitely a book that we barely ever take a look at. There might be, maybe there's one Haftorah from Joshua, I'm not sure, but we barely ever look at it. I mean, there's a lot of the prophets, obviously we see little bits and pieces of them in the Haftorahs that we read. And that includes the books of Kings and Samuel. but not so much Judges and Joshua. And then for the certain Chagim, we read the scrolls of Esther and Ruth and Lamentations and whatever, but the book of Job, we really basically never read unless we do a special class on it. Chronicles, we do a little bit of Ezra and Nehemiah, I think, is a Haftorah, but basically a lot of the Bible we really never encounter. So, and there's not as much written about Joshua. I mean, not like, the Torah portions have so much material. There's a lot less on Joshua and Judges and whatever. And then again, a lot of that stuff is actually Christian. Yeah. But anyway, it should be an interesting adventure. I mean, it's kind of appropriate that we just finished the Torah at the end of the year 2020. So we can start 2021 with a whole new adventure, crossing over into the promised land. We will get there, right? Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Made it most interesting.
Thank
Do
you.
you have a date that we meet again?
Well, January, we have already have the
January 9th
dates.
and 23rd, Rabbi.
Thank you, 9th and 23rd. And then we are going to, I have to put together a schedule for the rest of the year. So we'll do more in the rest of the year. So, and we'll see how far we get.
Is it still Torah study though?
Yes, we're going to call it Torah study. Yes. Torah study. Well, Bible study, should I call it?
Or Tanakh.
Tanakh.
Tanakh. We could call it Tanakh study. Maybe I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Oh, it's
We
my pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yes.
I enjoy, looking at all the different ways of interpreting these things. So, but
I
it's been
really
fun being
wish
with
I
you,
had
and we're
done
not going to stop.
I said, I really wish I had done this earlier. It's
Well, I'll tell you
fascinating.
what, if you want any of the earlier commentaries, Lynn has a big fat book where she's collected all of them.
Oh, wow.
So
Lynn, you're amazing too. We have a lot of amazing people here. Lynn is one of them.
of course.
I don't know about that one.
And she also keeps her body in great shape by hiking and doing all kinds of things, which I admire, because I don't like to do anything with my, just like to sit and I'd rather do a math
Yeah.
problem. Anyway,
Yeah,
okay,
can
so,
we mention her participation in Keep Riverside Clean and Beautiful.
oh yeah, that too. Absolutely.
So
Yay.
Rabbi, will you talk about Friday night service? What's going on Friday for Christmas? You said you have
We have a service at 6:30 on Friday, Christmas, and then following one is New Year's Day, also at 6:30. And I'll talk about the last couple. These are the last two Torah portions in the book of Genesis to end the year. It all sort of works perfectly this year. Okay, so I will see you guys again. It's been great, and it will continue to be, because we're going to continue studying together, right?
Rabbi,
Thank
can
you.
I ask a favor of you?
Ask a favor.
If you have any news of Heshi or Susan, would you text me, please?
I will. I'll check in with
Thank
them
you.
and see what's going on.
Well,
I'm very concerned. but-
And me too, please, because yeah.
Well, I can text you, Ruth.
Oh, okay,
I
that's
can text
fine.
both of you at the same time. How's that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, have a
Thank
great
you,
day.
Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom.
you. I'm looking forward.